We'll get started. And hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming today as we continue our spring semester of the Disentangling Disinformation series. Disentangling Disinformation is a series that began in the fall, born both out of the current global moment and also a reflection of societal shifts that have slowly been taking place over the course of decades and have made themselves more apparent of late. Disinformation is inevitable in this era. We live in a time where the confines of understanding are not limited to a lack of information, but rather a bombardment of countering narratives. It can be daunting to sift through the barrage of messaging, leaving room for the simple yet harmful decision to ignore it all. There's countless information that shelters what is happening in the world. Thus, disinformation is costing us the ability to stay accurately informed. This series of teach-ins aims to provide tools to navigate the current landscape of media and make sense of what we see, what we don't see, what may be in conflict with us amidst a continuing practice of self-education, and what we carry with us historically, as George will bring insight to today. This semester, we'll approach topics like doxing, the power of language, and terrorism. Please check out the Program on Peace and Development's website to see the remainder of the talks we have scheduled. I'll also share it in the chat later today. This series has come together as a combined effort from the Program on Peace and Development at Yale University, MADE, which stands for Mass Atrocities in the Digital Era, which is part of the Genocide Studies program at Yale, and the Department of Social Justice Education at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge the land that those of us based out of Yale University are privileged to operate in. Yale University acknowledges that Indigenous peoples and nations, including the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Scaticoke, Golden Hill Paugussett, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac and other Algonquin-speaking peoples, have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these peoples and nations and this land. I'd also like to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to also work on this land. My name is Hera Jaffrey. I'm glad to meet you all and see many of you here again. Thanks for coming back. And I'm happy to sort of represent these organizations bringing this series today. And I will pass it on to my colleague to introduce our speaker.
Great. Thank you, Hera. My name is David Simon. I am the director of the Genocide Studies program, which Hera had mentioned, as well as the director of the MADE subgroup there, the MADE initiative on mass atrocities in the digital era. Tremendously grateful for Hera's work in putting together this series. It's such an important topic. It is exactly the time to be discussing it. And it's really a wonderful slate of guests that she's lined up, including today's, of course. And today we're really lucky to have with us Georgios Vizyenos, who grew up on the island of Cyprus. After completing his military service, he received a Fulbright to study at Cornell, where he completed his Bachelor's of Science in Education in 1990. He subsequently studied modern Greek, classical Greek, and modern Spanish literature at Harvard University, and wrote his dissertation on the poetics of C.P. Cavafy's love poems. It was entitled Try to Guard Them, Poet, Homoeroticism and the Poetics of Opacity in C.P. Cavafy. I love that title. I'll just add. In 2000...
you didn't call him Gaddafi, which is the usual slide there. Okay.
Well, good. Yes. And I figure I'm batting at best about 358 on pronunciation. So I've got to do something right. In 2001, George joined the then newly established program in Hellenic Studies at Yale as a language lector, and in 2004 was promoted to associate program chair. He has published articles on the oral tradition and has more recently focused on the alt-right appropriation of antiquity. In addition to his academic work, he has developed two electronic projects, Lexis and Ikones, for instructions in modern Greek. His research interests include music and national identity, religion and literature, cultural studies, reception studies, and gender and sexuality. His current research focuses on the literature of Julian the Apostate from the Enlightenment to the present, as well as I said before, the appropriation of antiquity by the alt-right. George, thank you for being with us today. And with that, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you both, David and Hira, for the invitation. And you're forgiven for mispronouncing anything, because I will probably mispronounce everything in the talk today. And since this is a talk about barbarism and alternative ways of speaking and pronouncing, I think we're all have a free hand at everything today. So we may cover, I will actually cover accents as well. Maybe if I can share my screen, and if I can do it properly. Okay, sound. So I'm kind of an outlier in this series, because I'm not talking about contemporary events as such. I also come from the discipline of literature and cultural studies. So much of the conversation that I think has already taken place in this forum has been about contemporary and recent developments in warfare, atrocities, and human rights violations, which I think is a good way to begin to grasp of what this term of barbarism, which is what I thought I would be talking about, and I guess that's what I'll be talking about, not disentangling misinformation. I hope I managed to at least weave some narrative instead of disentangling threads. But I do think today, basically, the term for me means barbarism means atrocity. Nothing more, nothing to do with the old terms, even as recent as the middle of the 20th century, about savages or uncivilized people, which was the rhetoric of the 19th century. So, and because I do like barbarians, I thought I would look at them from a different angle. The question of an affective relationship that we may have with this other, right, which is the barbarian. And so I'll be tracing that line of thought through my talk. And since I have I've had a dog for the last 8 years, I tend to see the world often through the dog's eyes. And one of the ways that we can understand the term in ancient Greek is precisely that it is gibberish. This is what the term meant, that the Greeks thought everybody else who didn't speak Greek basically spoke something they couldn't understand. And so kind of in reverse to what dogs hear, the Greeks would hear var, 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 right? So when in English you hear something you don't understand, you say it's all Greek to you, right? So in this case, there's a kind of double barbarianism, I guess, here. You are the barbarians and I'm the Greek. And in the English context, I am the barbarian and you are, well, I guess the Greeks of English. But it turns out that Chinese is the language that most other languages consider to be the most alien by far. Greek features there as well, strangely also Spanish, as well as certain other kind of expressions that have to do with the sound of birds and that kind of thing, that people say nonsensical words sound to them. I'm also putting here in the background the Great Wall of China, obviously, that monumental blockade of the barbarians that in its own time also got infiltrated, right? So just to go through the specifics of the term, in the Greek context, the word barbaros, which is has an Indo-European root that means nonsense, inarticulate, not uncivilized, right? So for the Greeks, barbarian was anyone who spoke another language, or during the Hellenistic period, when Greek was the lingua franca of the East, someone who spoke Greek badly. So I guess whenever I make a mistake in English, I revert back to my barbarism. So when the Greeks begin to use it in a historical context, the barbarians are not uncivilized, they're not savages. They're in fact quite civilized and maybe even over-civilized. The Persians, for instance, who were the the dominant culture of the time, would have been called barbarians, as well as the Scythians up in the north, who, I guess, in the Roman context, would have been called uncivilized and savage and cruel and all sorts of other florid epithets that the Romans attached to the northern tribes above the empire. Now, for the Greeks, the Romans too were barbarians, by the way. So I guess you know, the loan from Greek to Latin became naturalized for the Romans. But the fact is that even the term itself, barbaros, is probably has nothing to do with the sound of the languages that the Greeks heard. At the turn of the millennium into the first millennium BC, the Greeks would have been in contact with dozens of people speaking different languages from different language families. So it is highly unlikely that what the Greeks heard was var, 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 right? So the other thing is, I'm pretty sure that since in Greek the word logos means both reason and language, that they didn't think that the rest of the world spoke nonsense just because the Greeks couldn't understand. But the phenomenon of this particular term, barbaros, begins to gain some ascendancy sometime in the end of the 6th century, particularly in Asia Minor, as they're coming into conflict with the Persian Empire, and somewhat later on during the classical period, especially in Athens, as Athens itself has instituted an empire of sorts in the Mediterranean, in the Aegean, and basically controls its allies of the Delian League, and has to propose an imminent threat of the barbarian, right? So the term has a historical setting. I'll be looking today a little bit more into the question of a precedence of the term in Greek religion and mythology, so that to me, it seems that the Greeks had been already talking about a sense of barbarism within their own religious system and within the umbrella of the pantheon of the Olympian gods. So since I will be focusing on the language, I will be going back and forth between the ancient times and a modern Greek poet called Constantine Cavafy, who lived in Alexandria in Egypt under the British administration. He was born in 1863 and died in 1933. And if somebody does the math, he should be 70 years old, if I got the birthday wrong. He also spoke his own version of Greek and was particularly interested not in the classical period of Greece's history, but in the Hellenistic and the Roman period. Of course, the Hellenistic period gave us what we call Common Greek, Κοινή Ελληνική, the language that developed out of contact with in the administrative circles of the empire and the Hellenistic kingdoms, and of course led to this split eventually of the written language from the spoken language that we call diglossia, something that in fact persisted in history to up until the end of the 19th century. Actually, somebody would say up until 1974, when Greece had one formal language officially, and the people and the literati and the artists used a common version of the spoken language. In fact, in the 19th century, the Greek state instituted a linguistic program of cleansing the spoken dialects of any foreign words, in a sense, debarbarizing them. I guess an ambitious project that soon fell flat on its face because people refused to learn that language. Now, the word barbarian is, of course, an exonym. There's no people that call themselves barbarians, except the Berbers of Northern Africa, who themselves don't call themselves Berbers, actually, but their name is traced back to this term, barbarian. The term Greece itself is an exonym. Greeks do not call themselves Greek. They call themselves Hellenes. But even there is a split in the language of what it is that we are calling each other. One of the terms that had been in currency up until, I guess, the middle of the 20th century, but also still in poetry, is Romniosini, Romnios, which means literally Roman, and occasionally the Greek version of the Latin term for Greek, Greki. So, yes, Greeks have a lot of names to go by, and they can choose which one depending on the moment and the ideological context. So this is what I'll be doing today. And let's get a little bit of sense of where this language resides today. I have a little clip from some show. I don't know what show it is, but let's have a listen to it.
Yes, what word for a primitive or uncivilized person was originally used in ancient Greece to refer to anyone who was a foreigner or didn't speak Greek? No, barbarian.
Okay, now both of them are wrong actually, because yes, the Greeks did use barbarian for foreign speakers, but not, as I said before, for uncivilized communities, whatever that might have meant for them at the time. But the contemporary term of Balakas is an interesting one here because it is an old word, it is an ancient word. It basically meant in antiquity softness, tenderness, weakness, even during the Hellenistic period, effeminacy and indolence. In the Byzantine period, the Middle Ages, it came to mean disease, weakness, and masturbation. In fact, this was a term that St. Paul used in his letters to describe the new Christian body as one that needs to be harnessed and disciplined. And one of those things that men should abstain from is masturbation. Now, today, the term primarily means masturbation, but also nonsense. Nonsense words or nonsense acts. So in a sense, it is tied back to this idea of the Greeks' understanding of the Asian dynasties and kingdoms as being luxurious, soft, and effeminate, because they were, get rid of that guy, because they were, in a sense, over-refined, too refined for the Greeks' sense of masculinity. That probably is a projection as well, but we'll get to it when we get to the art here. Now, in the last couple of decades, there's been a barbarian renaissance. If anybody is watching television these days, I'm sure you may have seen this one, the Dothraki, right? The Scythians, I guess, of the series. And more recently, this TV series from, I believe it was Canadian production, Canadian and Irish, called Vikings. And my favorite is a Norwegian TV series called Norsemen, which is a kind of a Monty Python version of the Vikings. It's quite a funny one, and there's a Roman slave there who's trying to civilize them. And the last one is from last year. I think it's now streaming on Netflix. It's a German Netflix production called Barbarians. And I will return to this one because of a particular statue that was erected in Germany at the end of the 19th century to commemorate the victory of the Germanic tribes, or what at the time thought they were entirely Germanic tribes, of the against the Romans in AD 9, I think. Okay, so keep watching television. I think they're great series in their own way. But the reason I'm bringing these up is because one of the projects I'm following these days is the appropriation of images of Spartans in ancient Greece and Nordic mythology in extreme right movements in Europe and here. And speaking of extreme movements of sorts, and because I am a student of language, we might as well start with the latest formulation of barbarism from a certain very famous American businessman and politician that I think you will guess just from the rhetoric who he is. They are coming from Asia, They're coming from the Middle East, coming from all over the world, coming from Africa, and we're not going to stand for it. They're destroying our country. They're killing our people. They're killing our country. We have languages coming into our country. They have languages that nobody in this country has ever heard of. It's a horrible thing. It's a horrible statement to hear, but it is quite a telling statement, I think, in how, well, ex-president, former President Trump is now turning his attention to language. Perhaps there is a problem with language in this country. In further down in this speech that he gave last month, he also talks about the difficulty of learning these new languages that nobody has heard of. I'm not quite sure what languages he's referring to. My guess is that he's not referring to any language. All that this says is there's something unknown out there and you should be fearful. That is what I'm reading in this statement. But it would be a nice game to ask. What is these languages that nobody has heard of? Spanish, Arabic, Karen. I guess no one has heard of Karen. I saw that Karen is a language in Southeast Asia. And of course, there are many languages that I don't know, including the ones that Hira mentioned before about native communities in Connecticut. So the use here of the unknown is what is disturbing and terrifying in this sense, because there is a context for it already. It's the English-only movement. Followers of that movement don't call it English only, they call it official English movement. And there is a reaction to it, which is called English Plus. I'll get to this towards the end of the talk if we have time, but I might as well mention another linguistic innovation that the governor of Florida had last year, which was, as you know, in his reforms of college education. He has banned the study of various topics that he finds political or politicized or offensive. And he has determined that people should only be teaching topics and that end in ology or techne, these two Greek terms, right? Ology basically means the study of something, techne means the art of something. And so everybody out there, please start revising your syllabi to genderology, raceology, and all sorts of other ologies that we have yet to discover. But this is the state of affairs here in the United States in respect to language. I'm quite curious to find out who the followers of English only are, and what it is that they feel about English, because my impression is that English, and American English, is quite tolerant and receptive of foreign accents, at least. They're not like the French, who will reprimand you or correct you if you mispronounce things. There's in many ways, there's a Babylonian bouquet of accents in the United States, and nobody bats an eyelid that people speak differently or even wrongly, right? So I guess English today is much more tolerant than Greeks were back in antiquity. So it is surprising that language is entering this fray now. And let me see. Okay, so here's the first poem I'd like to introduce. This is by the poet Constantine Cavafy. As I said, he lived in Alexandria, and in many ways, he is an imperial subject of the British Empire and had a great interest in the non-Greek subjects of the Hellenistic kingdoms. And here's one of a certain prince from Western Libya. Libya at the time was Northern Africa. So here we go. Overall, he was well liked in Alexandria during the 10 days that he sojourned there. Aristomenes, the son of Menelaus, the prince from Western Libya. Like his name, his attire too, quite suitably was Greek. He gratefully received his honors, although he didn't court them. He was unpretentious. He would spend his time shopping for Greek books, history and philosophy especially. Above all, however, a person of few words. He must have been a deep thinker, it was widely said. And for such men, it's only natural not to talk too much. No deep thinker was he, no anything. A commonplace, laughable sort of person. He took a Greek name, dressed like the Greeks, learned more or less to behave like the Greeks. And in his heart, he dreaded that by some chance he would lose the goodish impression he had made by speaking a terribly barbaric Greek, and that the Alexandrians would poke fun at him, as is their wont. Horrid people. For this reason, he confined himself to a few words, frightfully attentive to his declensions and his accent, and grew bored to death with all those conversations piled up inside him. At first glance, this is a book that mocks Aristomenes, clearly, but it also has the quintessential structure of Cavafy here. We have 3 stanzas, and the first one is more or less an objective presentation of the situation, and then the second and third are either in conversation or in contrast to the previous one or to each other. So notice that in the middle paragraph, for instance, the butt of the joke are the Alexandrians themselves, whose pretensions of superiority are mocked by the narrator there. And also that towards the end of the poem, it's not quite clear that Aristomenes has nothing to say. He just doesn't have the language to say it, right? So this ironic twist that Cavafy brings to the poetry will reappear in the rest of the poems that I will examine today. And we will see kind of the way that he straddles both sides of the argument here. He's clearly a lover of Greek, but also understanding that there are limitations and differences here, including himself. He was apparently very proud that he spoke English without an accent. And rumors had it that he even had an English accent when he spoke Greek, a slight accent, by the way. And his language itself is also peculiar to Alexandria and not the same as the rest of mainland Greece, at least. Now, as I said, I come into this topic from an entirely different field than political science or sociology. I teach a course on the Olympics. I teach a course on Dionysus in the modern period. And since I also do Hellenic Studies, I have come across this question of the savage and the uncivilized at the beginning of the Olympic Games at the 19th century. And of course, in the study of mythology, there is an extensive discourse on the nature of the human subject in the mythology, right? And of course, one of the ways that today we're using the term barbarism is not by using it itself only, but also by dehumanizing others, particularly calling them animals. Right, and I will get to animals towards the end of this slide, but it bears some attention to see what figures in antiquity, in the myths of the Greeks, would have been templates or allegories of the human subject. Obviously, horses, centaurs, rams, goats, and their attendant hybrid humans, satyrs, and of course the centaurs. And I have on the slide there probably my favorite image of the Minotaur, right? This hybrid figure with the head of a bull and the body of a man, and his mother there scowling because he doesn't look pretty, I guess. But really, it's her fault. It's not his fault. But I won't get into it. Actually, this is a part of the narrative of abductions and rapes that have to do with the Greeks and their gods and foreign women, but I'll get that to a little bit later. Now, there's also an interesting relationship between the god of reason and light and music, Apollo, and Dionysus. Dionysus in the Greek tradition is perennially presented as an import from the East, even though archaeology says that he is probably one of the oldest gods worshipped in Greece. And one of the peculiar characteristics of these two gods is that they are antagonistic to each other, but they're also complementary. So in the summer, the site of Delphi was dedicated to the cult of Apollo. And in the winter, because of various geological changes having to do with the gases that the Pythia inhaled, the oracle was shut down, and the cult of Dionysus took over. There's even a vase showing the two gods shaking hands. But there's an interesting substratum here for me, in that even at this very cult, this very site of the quintessential god of reason and clarity and light, Apollo, we have an underlying, shall I call it barbarity? Because the Pythia is not really articulating anything comprehensible. She's spouting out gibberish that then the priests would have to compose in hexameter. But even there, when we do get the stanzas from the priests, the prophecy is invariably ambiguous and crafty and dangerous because of misinterpretation. There's also an aspect of Greek religion that is particularly foreign to us and difficult to understand, and that is the pattern of worshiping extremity rather than virtue or morality as Christianity later on introduced. There's a famous incident of an athlete who committed a foul. He actually killed his opponent at the Olympics. He was deprived of his prize, and coming back to his hometown, infuriated and angry, he demolished the school, killing a number of children, I think around 27 or 30, and then disappeared in the temple of Athena. And what did Delphi say? Delphi said, Cleomedes of Astypalia is the last of heroes. Honor him, honor with sacrifices him who is no longer mortal. This is a puzzle for us, right? But it says something about the way Greeks understood extremity and divinity, right? So one of the ways, and I'll get to this in the next slide, but one of the ways also to look at this is the way that extremity in the myth of the Iliad, the conquest of Troy by the Greeks, also brings this question of extremity. The first word of the Iliad is menos, the fury of Achilles. And the last phrase of the epic is Hector, tamer of horses, right? And I'm putting there Aphrodite and Ares as being the two gods that are relevant to my discussion here, because we do have a narrative that is about lovers. Achilles and Hector are both lovers to their respective partners, Patroclus and Andromache, but they're also warriors, right? And of course, Hector is the much more civilized warrior than Achilles. So another split there, and we'll see it in the next slide, is how Greeks understood war, right? Now, if you want a cynical view of this whole story and the way that Greeks understood unconventional behavior, I'm explicitly talking about the philosophical movement of Diogenes and the Cynics there, which of course comes from the word dog, right? That the other is an animal, the other is a dog. This is the favorite insult of Greeks to the Turks, and the favorite insult of the Turks to the Greeks. No disrespect to the dogs listening here, but it is a pattern of expressing the disdain of the other is to turn them into animals or speak of them as if they were animals. And here we have the pediment of the temple of Zeus in Olympia. It doesn't show Zeus here. It shows Apollo in the center. And on the sides, we see a struggle. We see a fight. This is a wedding ceremony during which the Lapiths invited the centers to the wedding of Hippodamia. And forget the groom's name here. It's not Pelops. It's not the marriage of Hippodamia and Pelops. In any case, Hippodamia also means the tamer of horses, But these horses are untamable because they were not moderate in their consumption of alcohol, right? So there's Dionysus again, intruding into a wedding feast and wreaking havoc. And of course, Apollo there presiding and making sure that civilization wins over barbarity. You can't see the details there, but there is one particular composition, I'm not going to show it to you, where the centaur is not fighting like he should be. He's biting the poor Lapith. Now, one of the ways that I get into this topic and examine the language of intimacy or of affection, desire, is to look at this institution that was foundational in ancient Greece, the institution of xenia, of hospitality, which was a way to forge bonds across families from different areas of Greece, but even also with non-Greeks. Right now, what is it that barbarians do that is so offensive and so alluring in many ways? First, well, they're the arrogant children and violent children of Ares, supposedly, right? That they're savage in their war activities, and they're also sexually shameless, right? This is the understanding that we have also from the literature, but I'll get to it in a little bit more detail. Now, pillaging was a common practice among all people, so I don't think the Greeks could accuse any barbarian of pillaging other people's property when they conquered their cities. The Greeks did it all the time, but here is the one violation that seems to be more offensive: the violation of hospitality. The violation of hospitality can be twofold. One is from the host who is offering the wrong type of food, especially offering human food to the gods or to each other, but also this the pattern of abducting and raping and eventually marrying women from other communities, which was presumably, and I guess historically, the pattern of populating a newly found city that is entirely consisting at the beginning of males, right? And Greek colonization begins soon after they emerged from the dark ages of the second millennium, so around 800, we have the spread of Greek cities around the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, and they come into contact with all sorts of people that they would have otherwise not have been in contact. And so we have this pattern that is a historical phenomenon, the abduction of women in all sorts of cultures, by the way, right, including Rome. And it is played out in the myth of the Olympic Games as well, at the Temple of Zeus. And there it is the groom, Perithous. Now, the Iliad itself, we think of it as an epic of war, but it is predicated on an abduction again, a violation of xenia, of hospitality, by Paris, who abducted Helen. Also a violation of Menelaus, who left his guest alone with his wife, right? And also the epic that ends with perhaps a redemption of the whole violation of hospitality by having Achilles, who had, towards the end of the novel, turned bestial in his fury, contain himself, restrain, and provide hospitality to Priam, who has come to beg for his son's body, his son being Hector, and the victim of Achilles' fury. Right. So, and I have there a little picture of young migrants in Athens and an old lady there offering them grapes. Now, of course, the term xenia is what gives us also the term xenophobia, right? Xenophobia. And today in Greece, we don't call xenia, we call it philoxenia, which is, again, a doubleness in the meaning of xenos in Greek. In Greek, the word can mean a foreigner or a guest, right? So that the one can flip depending on the context. Now, I'm going to speak very quickly through these because I think I'm not going to have enough time. I am looking here at certain divinities of the Greek pantheon that are either antithetical and complementary to each other, right? So Athena is the goddess of wisdom and strategy at war. So she is antithetical to Ares. And obviously at the Trojan War, they are on opposite sides. The interesting distinction here is the one between Aphrodite and Ares, the god of war and discord. Aphrodite is not only the goddess of love and lust and sex, she's also the goddess of social unity and harmony, of concord, of sociability. So it seems counterintuitive that she would be, well, in bed with Ares. But in bed she has been, in fact, as we read in the Odyssey. And Aphrodite there has, again, this opposition to war. One of her attendants is Irene, peace, right? But there's also a link to her, to war, in the sense that for the Greeks, both desire and war fury were understood as a form of mania, as a possession of the god, right? And there's an elaboration again of the opposition here, because Aphrodite is inimical to Artemis, the virgin huntress. But we see here a convergence of two phenomena, right? The one of mania and ecstasy, and one that is probably also we see it in other cultures, warrior cultures, where certain mind-altering substances might have been involved. Opium, for instance, cannabis, mushrooms, all sorts of other performance-enhancing ingestibles, they call them. Now, the same thing we see in Dionysus. There, the element of barbarism is more salient, but it's one of degree. Dionysus is, of course, a god of mirth and ecstasy and joy, but taken to an extreme, it can become terrifying and monstrous. He's also accompanied by music that is distinctly called barbarophonic, transliterating basically, barbaric sounding instruments, basically wind instruments, not plucked or stringed. And also these two gods can be extremely vengeful and violent, both of them, right? So here is the underbelly of Greek theology there. If you want me, I can give you kind of more contemporary terminology for these, how the return of the repressed, the uncanny, objection, projection, displacement. But I think these are what's operating here for the Greeks and the way they understand their nature and others' natures. Now, by the 5th century, I'm sorry, we begin to have a much more perhaps detailed description of what barbarians get up to. And here's one example from Euripides' Andromache. Andromache was the wife of Hector, and she became a slave to the son of Achilles. And in this story, in this particular tragedy, she's the slave of Neoptolemus, and his wife, Hermione, is jealous of her because Hermione cannot have children. And so this is what she says to her. Such is all the race of barbarians, father and daughter, mother and son, sister and brother made together. The nearest and dearest stain their path with each other's blood, and no law restrains such horrors. Bring not these crimes among us, for here we count it shame that one man should have the control of two wives, and men are content to turn to one lawful love, that is, all who care to live an honorable life. Now, I don't know what the Athenian audiences thought when they heard these lines, but I would have thought this is very thick coming from Hermione, right? She is the daughter of Helen and Menelaus. She is descendant from this notorious house of Atreus, back at which point somebody, one of her ancestors, we know who it is, tried to feed his son to the gods. her mother ran away with a barbarian prince, and she is about to actually flee Thessaly with her first cousin, Orestes. So I'm reading here some kind of an ironic twist on what Greeks are supposed to be and what barbarians are, because what we find, I think, consistently in the 5th century particularly, a kind of revisionism of the barbarian. I'll give an example first of Herodotus. Herodotus is credited and blamed for a lot of things, including the inventing of formal invention of barbarians, but his description of them does not read to me a condemnation of the barbarian. And if I can move my images here. This is the beginning of his history. I, Herodotus of Halicarnassus, am here setting forth my history. That time may not draw the color from what man has brought into being, nor those great and wonderful deeds manifested by both Greeks and barbarians failed in their report, and together with all this, the reason why they fought each other. Now, what follows this is the chronology of abductions of foreign women by Greek gods or Greek heroes, and the abduction of Greek women by the people of Phoenicia, let's say, or the East, right? And there, Troy is supposed to be part of the East. We also have, again, another monumental work by Aeschylus, The Persians, that looks at the defeat of the Persians from the perspective of the queen in Persia and the entire court, in fact, including this wonderful and almost Homeric memorial of the fallen Persians with full articulation of their beautiful names. It isn't a triumphal piece, but it is also asking us to look at the Persian hubris and its cost on the Persians themselves. If we look at Euripides, it gets even better, because all the Greeks in those tragedies that include barbarians turn out to be, well, despicable characters, to put it mildly, right? The Trojan War is presented as a war of atrocity on behalf of the Greeks. There is a tragedy called Trojan Women that Euripides staged about a month and a half after the Athenian democracy raised the island of Milos for refusing to join them in their alliance, the Delian League. The Athenians went there, killed all the men, and enslaved them, children and women. Now, whether Euripides intended this as a critique of the war, of that particular massacre, is besides the point for me, because it is precisely the giving voice to those slaves that would have resonated whether Euripides intended it or not. Now, we can think of also Cassandra in Aeschylus's Agamemnon, but also Medea, the notorious and ever troubling Medea, who, after having, well, first killed her brother to escape from Colchis with Jason, then went on to kill her children and his children because he was going to marry another princess. But lo and behold, at the end of the tragedy, Medea does not get punished. This white stretch limo shows up at the palace. She gets in and goes to Athens, where she has a second life as let's say, a fertility advisor to Theseus. Now, sorry, I missed. Now, Edith Hall has written a book on barbarians back in the late 80s, and I guess this is where I hadn't read this book before I began this talk, but it turns out she has said everything I have been thinking about. The Greeks' view of the barbarian was inherently contradictory. For civilization's view of itself as in a process of linear progression is never unquestioned. The rise, paradoxically, is seen also as a fall. The retrospective vision incorporates as you may, incorporates the idea not only of primitive chaos, but of a more virtuous era when men were nearer to the gods. This schizophrenic vision of inferiority and of utopia gives rise to an inherently contradictory portrayal of the barbarian world. What is even more interesting, I think, historically, is to look that also Greeks accepted the fact that even they could be barbarized. They could lose their privileged Greek status. And Cavafy was quite fond of topics like this, moments of rupture, moments of change, of decline, of loss. And here's one that he takes from an excerpt of Athenaeus and turns it more or less into a poem without changing too much of it. But I'll read just the poem of Cavafy. It's called Posidonians. It refers to the city of Paestum in Sicily, the Greek city dedicated to Poseidon of Doric descent. And here's what happened to these inhabitants. The Greek language the Posidonians had forgotten after centuries of intermingling with Tyrians and Latins and other foreigners. The one ancestral feature they retained was a Greek festival, with elaborate rites, with lyres and oboes, with contests and garlands. It was their custom at the festival's conclusion to tell each other of their ancient practices and to pronounce Greek words again, which but a few of them any longer understood. And their holiday would always end in melancholy, for they would remember then that they too were Greeks. They too Italiots once upon a time. And now how far they had fallen, what had they become that they should live and speak like barbarians, remove disastrous fate from the culture of the Greeks. Now, this is written in the 20th century, obviously talking about some event in 2,000 years before, at least. But I think this is the kind of poem that resonates, let's say, in communities of diaspora around the world, communities that have undergone partial or total integration into their new homelands and still retain at least the ritual practice of their ancestral culture without necessarily either having an understanding of where it fits into the religious context or what language governed those particular rites in the first place. So even though Cavafy is looking to the past, his vision is always the present. And because, in a sense, he was also the barbarian among the English. And this is not an exaggeration. If I had time, I would have gone through Lord Byron's notes of his poem "Pilgrimage of Harold." I forget the full name of the poem, but in the notes, he's clearly seeing the Greeks as a community that needs to be protected, even controlled, and governed by some greater power. So Greeks of the 19th century were fallen Greeks, but here I would like us to turn our attention to a fallen Gaul. The Gauls, as you can see there from the map I stole from Wikipedia, as many other tribes in antiquity, migrated constantly, and at some point in the Hellenistic period in the 3rd century, they found themselves in north of Greece, eventually entered Greek territories, tried to sack Delphi. That expedition was a failure, but they ended up in the middle of Asia Minor by invitation of the Hellenistic rivals there who were trying to bring in mercenaries. Eventually, the Gauls were allowed to stay. They reverted back to their looting and pillaging of neighboring cities, Greek cities, up to the point where they were defeated in battle. And I'm losing my notes here, when exactly that was. But what we have in Pergamos is, in fact, these two statues actually it's the same statue. We have a second one that I'm not showing you today, that I think captures somewhat the transformation of the barbarian in the Greek imagination. Now, the pose of this man, who is presented here in the classic pose of a naked warrior. In fact, they did, for the most part, fight naked, which was not a particularly defensible way to fight. But the statue is given the dignity of heroic fallen warriors that we have prior to this. We can go back to the Temple of Aphaea in Aegina and the two statues of the fallen warrior from different periods that have the same pose. Now this one clearly identifies the man as a Gaul from the necklace, the hair, the mustache. There's even more having to do with the weapons that he's holding, but clearly it's a pose that is supposed to evoke not only the sense of triumph of the Greeks against the Gauls, but a sense of empathy of their dignity of their defeat. They were formidable warriors, and the fact that they fought so valiantly is, I think, represented here from a perspective that is not alienating us from him. It, in fact, invites us. The other statue is somewhat more problematic because it involves a suicide and what I would call the killing of the wife, but I'm going to leave that aside because it's a much more complex statue to go over at this point. Now, gazing at this statue clearly has all the features of a classic composition, the pose, the stand, the tilted head, but there is another aspect of it. I think that this sort of part of the whole experience of contemplating these statues is that there's an erotic component as well. Here's another poem by Cavafy, also set in the Hellenistic period, somewhat more east of the area the Gauls came to settle on. In fact, that whole area in central Anatolia was called Galatia, which is the Greek word for, well, France, really. Eventually, we will call them not Galates, but Galli. In any case, there is another small kingdom, lasted for about 150 years, around the town of Osroini, which is in northern Syria. And here is the context in which Cavafy brings this particular group of men, all of them, including the Greek one, described as different from each other, coming from different communities, and essentially barbarians to each other. But something wonderful occurs here in that the barbarian becomes the exemplar of the ideal Greek. Yesterday, around midnight, they brought us our friend Ramon, who had been wounded in a tavern fight. Through the windows we left wide open, the moon cast light over his beautiful body as it lay on the bed. We're a mixture here: Syrians, Greeks, Armenians, Medes. Ramon is one of these too. But last night, when the moon shone on his sensual face, our thoughts went back to Plato's Charmides. Charmides is a very famous character in Plato's dialogue, in which Socrates goes to the gymnasium, like he usually does, and gets entirely infatuated with this beautiful young man. So if one of the characteristics of the Greeks in opposition to their barbarians is that the Greeks are restrained and self-controlled and composed, I think reading that dialogue, we see Socrates almost losing it. In fact, I find the Phaedrus and the description of the chariot as an allegory of the soul to be almost pornographic in its excitement of describing the passions of the black horse. But here, I think Cavafy is somewhat more tempered and contemplative. And I have on the other side a statue, again, a Hellenistic. This is I'm not quite sure if this is a copy or not, but it doesn't need to be a bronze because it can stand as a marble statue. That shows not a human. This is, in fact, a satyr. And we know it because of the tail that seems to be visible on the side. Again, the body there open for our contemplation, but of a different kind of resting position, right? As opposed to this one that is collapsing and dying. Now, what about the rest of the Hellenistic legacy? We call that period between the conquest of Alexander and the fall and the rise of Rome in the Eastern territories as Hellenistic. And Hellenistic means something along the lines of Greekish, not entirely Greek, but Greek, a variation of Greek. Obviously, the term I'm taking there, judicious adaptations, is from the next poem that I'll read you. This one, however, is called Homecoming from Greece. Here, the dislocation of the home is no longer mainland Greece, but the East. And I'm going to read just an excerpt from it. This is the beginning of the poem. So we're getting closer to arriving, Hermippus. The day after tomorrow, I dare say, so said the captain. At least we're sailing on our seas, waters of Cyprus, of Syria, and of Egypt, waters of our beloved fatherlands. Why so silent? Ask your heart. As we draw even farther from Greece, weren't you happier too? Why fool ourselves? Surely that wouldn't be fitting for a Greek. Let's admit the truth from here on. We too are Greeks. What else could we be? But with loves and with emotions that are Asia's, but with loves and with emotions that now and then are alien to Greek culture. Now, Cavafy was very fond of history. In fact, he had said if he weren't a poet, he would have been a historian. And the history he's addressing here is not so much what was happening back then among the communities of the Hellenistic kingdoms, but what was happening in Europe and in Greece in the 19th century, when the Greeks were perceived as decadent, as fallen, as degenerate, as a sad remnant of the grandeur of ancient Athens, particularly, right? So his dislocation of the center of Hellenism to the east is part of his attempt to counter that argument, and the argument primarily of Gibbon, whose book he hadn't extensively annotated, with a lot of objections. I'm going to quickly, how am I doing with time? Very quickly end after this poem. Here's another one. Now, there is a bombastic expression in Cavafy occasionally, but I will point out to what it is that salvages that pompousness. So this is from a long poem that is, in fact, trying to ridicule the Spartans for not joining the campaign of Alexander, because they would not be led by anybody but a Spartan. So here we go. And from this marvelous pan-Hellenic expedition, triumphant, brilliant in every way, celebrated on all sides, glorified as no other has ever been glorified, incomparable, we emerged. The great new Hellenic world. We, the Alexandrians, the Antiochians, the Seleucians, and the countless other Greeks of Egypt and Syria, and those in Media and Persia, and all the rest, with our far-flung supremacy, our flexible policy of judicious integration, and our common Greek language, which we carried as far as Bactria, as far as the Indians. Talk about Lacedaemonians after that. Now, if you read enough Cavafy and you read this bombastic language, you begin to have second thoughts. And the second thought, in fact, should be our first thought, which is the title of the poem. The title of the poem is In 200 BC, which is just a few decades before all of these lands become part of the Roman Empire. So there's something in Cavafy constantly that is aware of change, of endings, of ruptures, of judicious integrations and moderations and adaptations, if you like. But notice that all of those Greeks in this poem would have been barbarians in, I don't know, 200 years before, right? And of course, this is the legacy of the Hellenistic kingdoms during the Enlightenment that were seen as barbarized, and that the Greeks lost their classical spirit. And here we come to perhaps my favorite representation of the barbarian in contemporary politics. This is the young man who dressed up as a Nordic warrior. I'm not quite sure what his paraphernalia is here, when he, along with the others, entered the capital on January 6, 2021. It's an impressive picture, I think. I like this particular one, but I also find it a little bit sad. This gentleman apparently was an aspiring actor, and clearly for him this was the great stage to perform whatever politics he is espousing. But because I am a scholar of representation and not of essences, I want to give us maybe a working definition of how style and barbarity work here. The canonical view of the fall of Rome up until maybe, I don't know, 30, 40 years ago was that here was a decaying and degenerate indolent society that was basically waiting for barbaric invigoration, and that this new sort of spirit of wilderness will fertilize the declining Roman Empire. This has come under attack in the last 30 years, both on the grounds that the barbaric tribes are already part of the Roman Empire, including several late emperors who were of non-Italic and Roman stock, and also the fact that not all of these tribes were Germanic, and also not all of these tribes stayed stationary through the ages until the 19th century and the re-emergence, according to the national narrative of Germany, of the new German society, right? And I want to say something here. This is, I hope you recognize him. He's Tiger Woods, standing in contrapposto, right? So here is the Greeks re-educating the Egyptians. I hope your hieroglyphic is still fresh, but I'll read it for you. Wow, is that Heptube? He looks amazing. How was Greece, Heptube? You look really relaxed. Yeah, I got into contrapposto over there. It's where you pull all your weight on one leg. I feel really dynamic. I love how his hips and shoulders are unparalleled. He just looks so alive, so graceful. And now you guys have to interpret what the donkey and the hole are saying there. I'm not going to tell you. But here is another example again of the representation of the barbarian. This is the German, the tribal leader that led the battle against the Romans in AD 9 and defeated them. His name is Arminius. He was elevated to the status of national hero in the 19th century, and this statue was made in 1898, which is just a decade after Miss Liberty there, right? And as you can see, those of you that have done your little contrapposto study, Miss Liberty is standing in classic contrapposto pose. Now, from the beginning of the 19th century, and particularly for Herder, the Greco-Roman tradition was the one that had to be rejected. So it makes sense that here at the end of the century, Hermann the German, as he has come to be known, is standing in a somewhat awkward position where he is trying to replicate these asymmetries of contrapposto, but not really doing it because he's not standing in contrapposto, because he shouldn't stand in contrapposto. That is the legacy that he fought against, right? But then again, even Hermann was, let's call him a mixer barbarian, because he had grown up in Rome, in fact, and had been in the Roman army until the campaigns to his I'm stuck here now. Okay. There is one poem that anyone interested in barbarians should read. It's rather long. I'm not going to read it for you today because it will take another 5 minutes. It's around 70 lines, but you can look it up. It's called Waiting for the Barbarians. This is also the title of a novel by Coetzee, the South African author, who named his novel after this poem, and is in conversation with this poem. And on the right, I have, again, a painting of the fall of Rome in 410 to the Visigoths, again, contemporaneous with the statues, and also at the point when Cavafy would have been around probably 30, 35 years old, right? So I'm not sure if he ever saw this, but you see here again, this rhetoric of vitality, of masculinity, of aggression and assertion, and slight homoerotic context as well. So speaking of which, again, I want to finish with this poem. I want again to point out to the date of the poem that it gives us, because many of the Cavafy poems will have this tension between the title and the actual poem. 610 in Alexandria is rather late. In another 10 years, the prophet will have his visions, or no, actually that's before. In another 40 years, Alexandria will be under the control of the Arabs, right? So here we go again. For Amonis, who died at the age of 29 in 610. Raphael, they're asking you to compose a few verses for the tomb inscription of Amonis. Something very polished in refined style. You'll be able to. You're the most suited to write what befits the poet Amonis, our own poet. Of course, you write about his poems, but write too of his beauty, of that fine beauty that we loved. Your Greek is always musical and beautiful, but now we need all of your mastery. Into a foreign tongue, our sorrow and love pass. Your Egyptian feeling pour into the foreign tongue. Raphael, write your verses so that they have, something of our life in them, so that the rhythm and every phrase declare that an Alexandrian is writing for an Alexandrian. And I'll stop there. I think the poem can take some more analysis, but I would rather wait if anybody has questions for me regarding the reference of this poem to my beginning with the objections of new languages coming into the country that we shouldn't be even know their names. And here's a wonderful poem where Cavafy kind of inverts the whole relationship of the foreigner and the barbarian, and we all become one happy Alexandrian community, which sadly was to end soon. But c'est la vie, as the French would say, in their own barbaric way.
Thank you, George. That was quite a fantastic tour. And as one who woke up this morning not knowing Cavafy from Gaddafi,
yes,
I am in a much better place. I also really appreciate translating it, as it were, in my own thoughts, my own language, that there's a language a vocabulary of barbarianism, and yet also a place for pluralism and a sort of lionization of pluralism, which is kind of the battle in our own times as well. I think there were a couple questions that came up in the chat and the Q&A, so I'm going to toss it over to Hira to ask those questions. I may follow up if there's time afterwards.
If I can add a slight comment to your observation, David.
Yeah.
Cavafy was the poster child of diversity and hybridity in Hellenic Studies in the 90s and early 2000s. My angle here is that Cavafy is not, hasn't gotten rid of the imperial nostalgia that we see in these poems of hybridity. Yes, they're all in fact, he has a lot of non-Greek characters in the ancient poems. None of them is Greek. They all have, but they're all Hellenized. And there is this tension between integration and maintaining your own community's culture.
Also very French, you might,
yes, exactly.
might add, in their imperial project to Francify.
Yeah, so he is, I guess, complicit in that discourse of imperial superiority of the Greeks.
Yes.
So.
Got it. So we have some audience questions. I'll start with one from an anonymous audience member who asks, do any modern day examples of this terminology occur in Greek culture or elsewhere?
The term is still active. In fact, I have a Google search that I receive messages every day of barbarians. As I said, it's mostly used, it's synonymous to atrocity. There are no barbarians. They are a wonderful myth and a wonderful projection. But I think in the last 200 years, we have come to understand social organization differently than we did even I guess 100 years ago, right? And there's a wonderful story by Borges called Dr. Brody's Report, and it's an anthropologist who goes into the jungle and finds this very primitive and very violent and very objectionable society. I mean, even their vocabulary is very limited. They don't have vowels. It sounds horrible. But towards the end, then he says, yes, but I've been talking about the differences, but there are also similarities. They have all the structures of society that we have. They have a sense of authority. They have a sense of religion. They have a sense of their language. They have all the constituent parts that make a society a society. And of course, then he ends with, and I'm sure your Majesty, because it's addressed to the Queen of England, would want to consider whether you want to apply the same method you have applied elsewhere, which is colonize them, because he also wants to make them Christians. So there are no barbarians today. I think the debate is happening around a different discourse, which is the discourse of human rights, of crimes against humanity. There's an entire legal superstructure that we now have, I guess, at our disposal to use both as a means of ameliorating aggression, but also of disciplining each other, or disciplining the ones that we can discipline and punish the ones that we can punish. But I think that's where the conversation is happening. I think it's wonderful that there is also this artistic re-engagement with the theme. It is being used in all sorts of different ways, however, that I think ought to sensitize us to the risks of overindulging in barbaric nostalgia. There's a lot of talk about Sparta these days that I find particularly offensive and scary. The other thing is, however, that none of these conversations has anything to do with history as such, right? So if you try to tell people, no, but the Spartans didn't do this or didn't do that, people don't care. People want the story, right? The narrative is more interesting to them and more useful to them than the actual fact. So to give you a very simple example, Reebok has been sponsoring the Spartan Games. These are camp activities for grown-ups. It's like in summer camp for grown-ups with lots of muscles, male and female, right? it's very combative, it's very militaristic, and of course, Reebok is trying to sell shoes. And it says, I think it's called Spartan, the series is called, made by Spartans for Spartans. Now, I'm sure no Spartan in Greece is making these shoes, and I'm sure no Spartan in Greece is wearing these shoes. Also, I want to remind Reebok that the Spartans did not wear shoes, right? But it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter. It really is how we reform these traditions, these stock characters, and how we make them useful for us. And we can, and there is no good or bad answer to this, because it depends on first our values and what it is that we're doing with them and how we're using them in which context. And some of them are objectionable, but they're also brilliant as kind of gestures. One of the more colorful of senators of the Republican Party, is her name? I forget her name, but she wore a mask during COVID because she had to, right? Eventually they were forced to, but on the mask she had the words "Molon Lave," which is a Spartan logo, a Spartan slogan that says "Come and get it." Right. So in that, I thought it was a brilliant act, actually, in that she was complying with the regulation, but she was also challenging its violation. And of course, the Molon Lave works there primarily for the gun rights. Come and get my guns if you can, right? So that's sort of where I come into this conversation and kind of see how Hellenism is used, because it is something that operates still with us with the kind of esteem that the ancient Greek still has, that we need to be aware of how it is exploited. And it is misinformation, most of it. Most of it is misinformation. I mean, it's all stories that are not historically accurate or even real. But that's why I study fictions, and that's why I'm not a historian, because I do think stories do matter.
I guess building off of the conversation of stories and narrative, I have a question from Hillary Pearson. She asks, my research follows Devin Healy's work in narrative inquiry. I understand that our contemporary Western culture constructs knowledge through storytelling by telling and retelling stories of barbarism, for example, and our culture attempts to make sense of these stories. The ways in which we construct sensible stories affect how we live in relation to others. I was wondering if you could tell us more about your understanding of how we as a culture interpret barbarism as a lack of culture or civilization, and maybe more importantly, how can we make meaningful change considering our interconnected knowledge and pasts and how they shape our future relations with current and future generations.
The way I understand the operation of the term is that it is a very selective vision of the other and of the self, right? The main objections that the ancient Greeks had about barbarians is that they were not free, that the barbarians lived under monarchies and absolute rulers, and that the Greeks lived in this anarchic system of the city-states that afforded them self-rule. And I only have one word to say to the Greeks: slavery. Slavery. Not all Greeks were free. Most Greeks were not free. All women were not free. Not all citizens of every city were, not all inhabitants of every city were citizens. And shall we mention the slaves? So for me, I think it's, if I were to say, is there a standard of civilization and barbarism, I would say slavery is barbarism. Okay, there's clearly worse things you can do to a person than slavery if you keep them, if you kill them, I guess. But if people are alive and they're slaves, That to me is barbarism. And that is something we need to be aware of even today, when ostensibly we don't have slavery, but we have different systems of oppression, of indenture, of kidnapping and holding people either hostages during war or hostages in host countries as working populations, and their passports are taken away, or their children are locked up in cages because they cross the border. So I think there's a lot for us to learn from these. And basically, because I do study narratives, I want to question the narratives. Some of the most wonderful stories that I cherish are very questionable, and they touch. This is where I wanted to bring the notion of affective relationship, that we do come in this with emotional attachments, and we need to recognize them and reckon with them, but also push back. I will tell you one thing that I think about Donald Trump, who is the butt of my criticism here, right? Make America Great Again is a fantastic slogan because it both promises some return to some golden age that probably never existed, and it's an imperative, it's an invitation, it sounds inclusive, but it's not. It also suggests that the greatness was possible and real and can still be. So it's in a nutshell, it's a fantastic slogan, but its application is horrendous, right? So I guess me as an instructor and as a teacher, this is what I want to sort of convey to my students, that and because I am a scholar of a student of art, I want us to be conscious of the seduction of art. Because there's a lot of things that I watched this. I actually couldn't see the last Barbarian series, the German one, because and I read the interviews of the director who says we tried not to hand this over to the alt-right because it was easily appropriated, but I still couldn't watch it because I was seeing too much of kind of German primal nationalism in it. And because I do teach the 1936 Olympics in Berlin, I am more sensitive to that than I would have been 10 years ago. That's the best answer I can give you. It sort of sensitizes us to see things a little bit more critically.
Thanks, George.
Can I I know here you can ask one more question, but that just resonated with a thought. So as they say in academia, a comment more than a question. But, I note the parallel between the Gauls as the barbarians for the Hellenic Greeks in one era, and the Germanic tribes that served as the barbarians to, among others, to the Romans a millennium or so later, at least half a millennium later. And that it is once again, the sense of what becomes the body ideal and the worship.
Yes.
It's the German image of old, which in part inspires this Aryan ideal in this, you teach it in your class or some version of this. But that echo really just struck me.
It's fascinating because when Leni Riefenstahl was doing the documentary for Olympia, for the Olympics, she actually went to Greece, and she was being escorted by a Greek photographer, also with the close connections to the fascist movement, fascist government in Greece, because Greece was under a dictatorship then, and also had been to Germany to meet Hitler. And of course, while Leni Riefenstahl was there, Leni Riefenstahl was thinking, oh, these barbaric Greeks that think they're Greeks. Little do they know that we are the real Greeks. So there's this play there of who is more Greek and who isn't. And of course, what happens? Leni Riefenstahl goes back to Germany, and she takes a little souvenir with her, a little boy toy, a young Greek man. This is amazing how the statues and the sort of sexual I mean, this is what I was trying to sort of tease out of Cavafy, is that Cavafy is attracted obviously to the beauty of young men. He was gay, right? But you see kind of how sexual attraction and the notion of civilization is tied in together. I mean, Lena Riefenstahl is the woman who appears naked at the very beginning of the documentary. She was a dancer, and there's three women, and one of them, three naked women, and one of them is Lena Riefenstahl. So there is something there, I think, that is not always, and of course, all of these sort of alt-right movements have to do with insecurities of masculinity, traditional masculinity, and so on and so forth. I mean, you can go back to the 19th century and muscular Christianity and all sorts of other movements that, including the Olympic movement. Yeah. All right.
Last question for today, and then we'll close. But I feel like the people who asked the questions were all in cahoots together and sort of, you know, built on from one to the next. But the last question is from an anonymous attendee who asks, the point about caring about the narrative more than the reality is incredibly interesting and important. Does anything work against the narrative of barbarism?
Does anything work against the narrative of barbarism? I think and I'm not quite sure who we could be, because I don't want to assume that my position is universal. I think the narrative of the barbarian can be instructive, can be also liberating. There are ways to take the objection of the barbarian to civilization in productive and even progressive ways. One of the ways, let's say, that it has been used in relation to European politics by the extreme right in Germany, I guess, is to critique the European Union. And what we have come to very politely call the democracy deficit, or something like that. Right? Now, that criticism need not come only from the extreme right. I think it should come from the left as well, or even the center, right? No one claims these stories for their own. Well, actually, maybe we all claim them for our own, but they're common at this point, including the barbarian. There's ways to speak of the barbarian as a lifestyle closer, let's say, to nature. In fact, the young man who dressed up in the sort of the horned outfit, if you read more, when he went to jail, he actually complained that he wanted to eat organic food, and it was such a almost jarring, because you wouldn't this is not the stereotype we have of the extreme right as being part of the culture of organic food or yoga or meditation or all the other kind of new spirituality practices today, right? That's so almost counterintuitive. I think narratives are so elastic and malleable that we can use them in all sorts of ways. I don't think we will ever well, we will never get rid of them, because we need them to structure our fantasies of who we are and who we do not want to be, right? And I think the barbarism, at least the way that it has been used in the past, is that's not the way we want to be. That's the way other people are. Now, that is in the optative, it's in the wishful thinking realm of thought. I mean, when I was preparing for this presentation, I was like, what is it that the barbarians have done that the Greeks haven't done? Right? And of course, this is something you can ask any kind of society that claims superiority. Whether it's the British in Cyprus and their colonies and their civilization project, or America's spread of democracy. I think, you know, this is what they allow us to do. It's a voice from a margin and from a border that I think should not be allowed to be exploited only by one group. I think the borders need to be porous, and let a few barbarians in. They may have a better language than well. I was planning to do a little bit of critical analysis of a transcription of Trump's speech, but I spared you all because, yeah, I'm not quite sure what this English movement, English only movement, for instance, is for, because English is quite popular still. I mean, it's not in danger of not being spoken by anyone. In fact, anyone who speaks another language also speaks English. So my answer is the more the merrier. More languages, please speak more languages, even with an accent.
I think that's a great way to end today.
Yes.
Among many messages today, I'd like to put that one in gold foil on the walls. But thank you so much, George, for coming, for sharing with us, for being part of this series and bringing a very different and appreciated lens to how we've been approaching this topic. So thank you again. I wanted to point everyone's direction to the next installment of the series, which picks back up after spring break, which I hope you all enjoy, which is on March 26th at 4 p.m. It's called Selling the Extreme, How Terrorists Use Marketing to Disseminate Their Propaganda. That will be led by Anna Kruglova from the University of Salford, Manchester. And the following day at noon, we have Coercive Control at the Micro and Macro Levels with Nicole Carreri from Boston University. So again, thank you, George. Thanks to all of you in the audience and attendance today. Thank you, David. And we'll see you all hopefully at the next one. Have a great weekend and a spring break for everyone who gets it.
Thank you, George, and thank you, Hira.
Bye.
Bye.